Welcome everyone to today's social system mapping SenseMaking session for today, October 2nd, 2022. Our hosts today are me, Christine Capra, co-founder of Greater Than the Sum and SumApp. And our producer is Kara Martner, and she'll also be doing tech support. So I'm going to skip this part because Vicki, I think you've seen it.
Yeah, I have. Thank you.
And I know Mary and Kara have seen it many times. So I'm just going to move on. And today's objectives, I'll skip the top three because they always stay the same. But the last two, what I'm really have been thinking about a lot lately is how when we're talking about complexity and or systems thinking, how easy it is for all of us to get overwhelmed and to start to feel anxious. And so that's the piece I wanted to think about today. So we're not going to go into a lot of theory, but we're going to just talk about that dynamic a bit. And so the challenges of systems thinking and complexity, and then also how we can start to generate some insight into how to deal with that cognitive overwhelm and challenge that complexity can induce. And I see we're getting a few more people, so welcome. We'll do introductions in just a moment, just sharing today's objectives. So the agenda for today is we're going to do some introductions and a little bit of framing. Then we're going to have a short breakout for you to get to know a couple other people in this group. And then I'm going to do some talking about complexity and systems thinking and overwhelm and how that all relates to embodiment. And then we'll do some longer breakouts to talk about ideas for how to work with the challenges of that. And then get back together, talk about what's emerging, and then do some community announcements. So you'll have a chance to do this together in a few minutes, but Kara, have you put the link to Kara will be, if she hasn't, put a link to a tool called Mentimeter for that we'll use for you to input information. That should be in the chat right now. Let me know if you're getting it and if you're able to get in. Okay, I see Tom nodding.
Yeah.
Okay.
There.
Okay, so this kind of requires you to toggle between your input interface and then the screen that I'm sharing. So if that becomes challenging for you, feel free to just default and go to using the chat, the Zoom chat. But we like to keep it in Mentimeter because then we have an easy way to collect what is what's coming up and what we're learning. So if you could go ahead then in the Mentimeter, if you've got it, and go to the slide that I'm on and share your name, pronouns, location, and a network or networks that you're supporting in some way or invested in some way. Happy to see you here with us, Min. A co-op network and a social service network and equitable evaluation practitioners, and nature connection networks, transformational city networks. So thank you all for sharing that. Dana, hi. I can't see you on my thing, so I didn't know you were here. Oh, look, we have a couple other people I wasn't seeing. And open my chat as well. Okay. So thank you for that. I'm going to move forward. Jacob, hopefully you'll still be able to put your stuff in the Mentimeter, even though I jump forward. So question for everyone, just so I know what to do next actually, is how familiar you are with social system mapping. So you could go ahead and answer that question in the Mentimeter. That will help me have a sense of where you're at with that. Can we have a rough idea? Can find your way around it. Okay. Okay. So what I'm seeing is that most of you are pretty familiar with social system mapping, at least with knowing how to navigate a map and interface with one. And then we have one person who has a rough idea of it. For the person with the rough idea, I'm gonna go through this little intro thing that I like to share with people, and hopefully this gives you a little more clarity, but it isn't actually looking at a map. And if you would like to actually look at a map and see one in action, I would suggest you join our next Monday session, which is going to be a great session with Sarah Shanahan of the REAMP Network, sharing her map. But, oh, I'll do that other thing in a second. But here's our question for today. This is the setting us up for the topic for today, which is when you encounter the words systems thinking and complexity, what happens in your body? What does it mean to you as an embodied being? How does your visceral self react to those concepts or those words? I invite you to go ahead and put that in the Mentimeter. So for some people, it's exciting and energizing. Exciting, lots to untangle, yearning for knowledge. Let's do exciting because I think there's hope. They're overwhelmed in how to explain and implement it. Yeah, a little overwhelmed, appreciating the naming of where we are. Yeah, I feel all of those things. Not sure where to start. And this Monday session every month is a torment for me because I don't know, like I struggle to break it down into a small enough. Anyway, yes, I totally can relate to all of that. Alert. Yeah, I get that. Our brains sort of turn on, and there's a bit of, for me, hypervigilance that starts to happen that takes me a little bit out of my body and out of my groundedness. So, Dana, I think you're the person who has the least familiarity with. Have you seen this little bit? Because if you have, I'll skip it, but if you haven't, I'll go through it quickly. And it's looking to me like you haven't.
I think you might be able to skip it.
Okay. I'll skip it. Because one of the things that happens to me when I have to start talking about complexity is that I get sped up and anxious about how much time I have. But I also don't want to leave people behind because I know that's not good. So, okay, so this is what, social system mapping is about, sort of a high level. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put you into breakouts. There'll be 3 people per breakout, and we'll give you 2 minutes each. And what I want to ask you to do is introduce yourself. You're going to have 2 minutes each. So in your 2 minutes, introduce yourself, and then just talk about a little bit about that. When I think of systems thinking and complexity, what happens for me. So I'm not asking for logic or for an academic description of complexity, but just what it does to you in your body. And I'm going to ask you to just practice really listening to one another and not giving advice, not even asking for more info, not probing and guiding that person. Just let that person listen to their body and speak for their 2 minutes and then move to the next person. And Kara, when you are ready, does anybody have any questions before Kara hits the go button for that? Looks good. Yeah, go ahead. I'm ready. If they're ready, go ahead. Welcome back. So I hope that was, I don't even know how many there, oh, there's Jacob. Okay, anyway, I hope that was, that you felt heard and you got to really explore all the feelings of systems. So let me go back to sharing my screen. No, actually, I'll just pause for a moment. So I just want to note, I mean, this is sort of our topic for today, is that social system mapping can be held in a very simple way, or it can be held in a very complex way. So on the one hand, it's just a bunch of information about us. It's one way that we get to share more dimensions of ourselves with a larger group than we normally share, than we normally get to without, spending a lot of time together, with a larger group that we share connections and work and purpose with. So it's, who are we? What are we working on? What do we care about? Why are we here? It's simple, basic stuff, but it's still really useful. Kind of like, if you remember those of you who are old enough, the old, phone books, those big yellow fat things that we used to all have. And you knew that you weren't expected to understand it or know anything about it or memorize it. It was just there for when you needed to look up a phone number. And, we all had them, and they weren't in the least bit intimidating, or they didn't make you uncomfortable or worry you at all, because you knew that we get to decide when and how much we needed it. And we felt free to ignore it the rest of the time. And so that's one way that we can hold a social system map, just sort of like that big fat phone book. We know there's a lot of information in there, but it doesn't scare us because we're not expected to do anything with it. And at first, in my experience with lots of arcs of lots of social system maps, at first that's really exciting and that's enough. And for many folks, that will always be enough. That's all they really want, and that's all they really need. But for people who are thinking more about system change and complexity and, get this idea in their head, which was the idea that sort of prompted me in doing all of this in the first place, was, the idea of the system seeing itself and how we would be much more effective if the system could see itself, that sort of thing. When we come to that point, we start to want more from our social system map. And we start to think about how can we, get those people who hold it like a directory, get them to at least keep it updated, even if they're not using it, but to help keep the data fresh and relevant. And but more than that, how can we start to use our social system map as a window into the complexity of the system changes that we're trying to work on? So, but to do that, to get that more from our maps, requires us to think systemically, and it requires us to start to use various systems thinking approaches to our own social system map, and to our work and to our shared purpose. Because if we're not applying systems thinking to our shared purpose, we have really not a whole lot of use for a social system map beyond the directory, and to do sense making with it. But when you're in a network with, a lot of different perspectives, and, some people are into systems thinking and some people are like, oh, don't bother me with that. They just want to get on the ground and do the work. It can be challenging, and it can be challenging for a lot of reasons. But the first one is, what does that even mean to think systemically? So I'm going to share with you Well, first I want to share with what is sense making. This is one definition. I know there are other definitions, but I think this one came out of Wikipedia, and I think it's a relatively shared definition, which is that sense making is a collaborative process of creating shared awareness and understanding out of different individuals' perspectives and varied interests. And so right away, we've got a lot of information. That implies a lot of information, people's different perspectives, different awareness and understanding. And so for each person involved, it means actually paying attention to a bunch of stuff that you don't normally think about because that's somebody else's perspective, like suddenly just inherently your knowledge is only is one piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle. And that in and of itself can be uncomfortable, and it's implicitly complex. Another part of this definition is that it's a response to novel or unexpected stimuli as it integrates new information into an ever-updating model of the world. And that's hard work, changing our beliefs, our worldviews. So it's cognitively difficult and effortful to actually say, here's my mental map, and oh boy, you just broke it. There's some other reality that I didn't see, and now I have to incorporate that. All of that, I don't know about other people, but I know and then the last piece is discovering our blind spots. And I know that when I discover my blind spots, because I'm like so brilliant that I think I don't have any blind spots. When I discover my blind spots, it's hard. Like I feel like I'm stupid, and I feel a little ashamed, like I've been kind of a jerk, and I feel a little bit called out. And so all of that is what we're asking people to do when we're asking them to deal with all of that when we create a social system map and take it beyond the directory level. And so sense making sounds great. I mean, using the word sense making in our marketing draws people. People are like, oh, that sounds really fun. And it is really great when it produces new possibilities. And that's the purpose of doing it. And that's the purpose of having a social system map, is to to create new collective possibilities. But it's not always comfortable. And I think sometimes we gloss over that fact. And what does it mean to think systemically? Well, okay, so that the first bullet in the sense-making place was a collaborative process of creating shared awareness and understanding out of different individuals' perspectives and varied interests. Well, that's one way, a very important way of thinking systemically. In one kind of a context, but I'm going to share with you a couple more frameworks about thinking systemically. And we're not going into what does all of this mean. We're not going into how do we apply that. That's not what this is about. What this is about is how does this make us feel? So I'm going to share these two frameworks, and I'm going to do them really quickly because we're not planning on digging into them. But I just want you to sort of listen to the framework, sort of just let it wash over you. Don't try to grab it and organize it and interpret it and dissect it with your brain. Just let it wash over you and see, as I'm talking about this stuff, what does it feel like? Or what comes up, what surfaces? So one framing, easy framing, or easy way to get a framing, this book, Systems View of Life by Fritjof Capra and Pier Luigi Luisi, and I am not related to Fritjof Capra, by the way, is basically systems thinking is a shift of perspective. So from focusing on the parts to focusing on the whole, from objects to relationships, from measuring to mapping, from quantities to qualities, from structures to processes, from objective to epistemic science, from Cartesian certainty, and now we're getting some big words, to approximate knowledge. It's inherently multidisciplinary. And they say that essential or systemic properties are properties of the whole, which none of the parts have. They arise from the patterns of organization. Okay, so that's a lot right there. Couple things to notice about this framing is that this one is really abstract. which is great because it can be applied to almost any kind of context, any kind of system, from natural systems to human systems. But also notice how these shifts of perspective that are being called out are not generally how we've been trained to think. They're not generally what's asked of us. They're not how we tend to process. And I know that, you know, most of you and me, I mean, most of us here have exposure to systems thinking. We consider ourselves systems thinkers to some degree or another degree. So, you know, we each have parts of this framework that we probably feel like, yeah, I'm actually kind of good at that piece. But nonetheless, these shifts are actual, like, making us think in a different way and attend to things in a different way, like pay attention differently, perceive differently. And that, again, creates complexity and is cognitively challenging given what the normal ways we interact and have been trained. And so I want you to notice those pieces, but also notice how many of those shifts that they're talking about can be supported by a social system map, which means that we can use a social system map to practice sense making together, to practice what would it mean with this map to shift from structures to process, or can we see quantities versus qualities in this map, to use it as a framework for practicing this new way of thinking in a context that's relevant to ourselves. Okay, so that's one framework. This other framework comes from the School of System Change, and it is called the System Practices. And I'm going to and so the first in this outside part is enabling the system to see itself, holding the whole picture. That starting point that I felt like a social system map was, you know, what I wanted it to help with. Working at different levels concurrently, identifying connections and how parts interact, engaging different perspectives, understanding agency, power, and responsibility, working with activating and resisting forces, considering different timescales and consequences over time, understanding patterns to make effective interventions, embrace complexity, constantly learning and adapting, constantly questioning assumptions, and then not least of all, this the core of their framework is the purpose, the deeper connection with purpose that we're focused on, which for them is what they're saying is working with a flourishing planet and people. Okay, so now we've got two frameworks. This one, a little more focused, a lot more focused on human systems as opposed to any kind of systems, much less abstract. But wow, even just like for me, like all those things, I go, yeah, that sounds great. That sounds great. But then in action, you know, when we're actually working together and we're doing stuff, like, how do I hold all that in my head? It's nearly impossible. And so when we start talking about getting more from our maps, we're inherently beginning to do this thing to people, which is like, without even looking at the map yet, we're just sort of like, well, putting all of us, even myself, like, where do we start? What do I focus on first? How do we do this? How do we help people sink into this? And it starts to feel uncomfortable, both as a practitioner trying to share this with other people, as well as with you know, for the people in the network. And I am confident that that there are people in this group today who have been dealing with this for a long time, and so I'm hoping that we might get some insights from you when we get to that point. But I'm just acknowledging the challenge of it, and I want to share a couple of videos that talk about this challenge. And hang on for a second. So we'll go to Joe, and let me just, I'm going to have to stop sharing for just a second. Did I not share all those with you?
You weren't sharing this whole time.
Oh, for Pete's sake, somebody should have interrupted me way sooner. I'm sorry.
We were following on the Mentimeter though, weren't we? I was.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm on Mentimeter.
It's all good.
Oh, thank God.
We'll call you out when you're screwing it up.
Well, usually, but you didn't do it quick this time.
You weren't screwing up.
I had a blind spot. I did not know I was not sharing Mentimeter. Okay, anyway, so I'm going to share my screen. Hang on one second. And let me just get to the, okay, sharing my sound, my system sound. Okay, here we go. Joe Shu.
I'd like to explain the typical process that we experience when we do a systems mapping process. So we start, this is the complexity, right? The complexity on this axis, and this is over time. So when we start with things we're familiar with, and we start mapping it out, this larger system and the interrelationship, and it gets more and more complex, right? What about this? What about that part? Double click on here, double click on that. So it gets more and more complex. And there will be a point where this dotted line shows our mental capacity. That is, our mind says, that is just too much. I cannot hold that. It's too complex for me. And what our natural tendency is actually saying, let's move back to where we're comfortable. So back to our silo thinking and action. The importance of this process and the collective discipline and cultivation that we want to have is we want to endure that process. We want to say let's continue this process. Let's keep on sensing that larger system, that complexity, knowing that once we see the larger whole that is relevant to our goal, there will be another process where we can start distill the core essence and the structure, right? The core drivers, the core structures, the levers that we can really pull as a collective. So we will synthesize, distill the core essence back down to where our mental capacity is comfortable. Then we reach strategic clarity. Ending up here is very different from ending up here, even though we're all in the comfortable zone. Here we have experienced that complexity, see the larger whole, and back down to the core essence, what we can work on and act together. So just having this in mind, holding this in our mind as we go through this process, that we will experience a zone of uncomfortableness and tension. Let's just hold that complexity together, cultivate that discipline, knowing that once we go through that, we will reach that clarity.
If you're a college student,
Okay, and I should have said that that was Joe Shu, who's the co-founder of the Academy for Systems Change. And I should have forewarned you, as a really quiet voice, and I can't really make it any louder, but hopefully you could hear him. And plus his graphics, I think, sort of tell the story. And what I take away, and one of the reasons I love this video, is just simply he's talking about the two together, how to get to strategic clarity sort of requires us to get into that, just that uncomfortable zone of overwhelm, taxing our cognition, but that gets us to a much better place. So he's both talking about the value of doing this, and he's talking about the challenge of doing this, and he's asking the people in that room to be okay with that discomfort. And while I share his sentiments, I sometimes have a hard time pushing people past that place. I feel like, oh, now I'm being abusive. Now, now they're gonna all disappear and hate me. And so that's, just a piece of the puzzle. And then Eric Berlow, he's an ecologist, and I'm going to share a video of his. This is like 3 minutes, so it's not long either. This is another approach to the same thinking, not the same. He's got another way of framing this.
You ever feel completely overwhelmed when you're faced with a complex problem? Well, I hope to change that in less than 3 minutes. So I hope to convince you that complex doesn't always equal complicated. So for me, a well-crafted baguette fresh out of the oven is complex, but a curry, onion, green olive, poppy cheese bread is complicated. I'm an ecologist and I study complexity. I love complexity, and I study that in the natural world, the interconnectedness of species. So here's a food web, or a map of feeding links between species that live in alpine lakes in the mountains of California. And this is what happens to that food web when it's stocked with non-native fish that never lived there before. All the grayed out species disappear. Some are actually on the brink of extinction. And lakes with fish have more mosquitoes, even though they eat them. These effects were all unanticipated, and yet we're discovering they're predictable. So I want to share with you a couple key insights about complexity we're learning from studying nature that maybe are applicable to other problems. First is the simple power of good visualization tools to help untangle complexity and just encourage you to ask questions you didn't think of before. For example, you could plot the flow of carbon through corporate supply chains in a corporate ecosystem, or the interconnections of habitat patches for endangered species in Yosemite National Park. The next thing is that if you want to predict the effect of one species on another, if you focus on only that link and then you black box the rest, it's actually less predictable than if you step back, consider the entire system, all the species, all the links, and from that place, hone in on the sphere of influence that matters most. And we're discovering with our research that's often very local to the node you care about, within 1 or 2 degrees. So the more you step back, embrace complexity, the better chance you have of finding simple answers, and it's often different than the simple answer that you started with. So let's switch gears and look at a really complex problem, courtesy of the US government. This is a diagram of the US counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. It was front page of the New York Times a couple months ago, instantly ridiculed by the media for being so crazy complicated. And the stated goal was to increase popular support for the Afghan government. Clearly a complex problem, but is it complicated? Well, when I saw this in front page of the Times, I thought, great, finally something I can relate to. You know, I can sink my teeth into this. So let's do it. So here you go, for the first time ever, a world premiere view of this spaghetti diagram as an ordered network. The circled node is the one we're trying to influence, popular support for the government. And so now we can look 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees away from that node and eliminate like 3/4 of the diagram outside that sphere of influence. Within that sphere, most of those nodes are not actionable, like the harshness of the terrain, and a very small minority are actual military actions. Most are nonviolent, and they fall into 2 broad categories: active engagement with ethnic rivalries and religious beliefs, and fair, transparent economic development and provisioning of services. I don't know about this, but this is what I can decipher from this diagram in 24 seconds. When you see a diagram like this, I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to be excited. I want you to be relieved, because simple answers may emerge. We're discovering in nature that simplicity often lies on the other side of complexity. So for any problem, the more you can zoom out and embrace complexity, the better chance you have of zooming in on the simple details that matter most. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay,
Yes, we can.
thank you. Why is that not closing and going away? Stop. Sorry. Okay, now where's my thing? Oh, no, did I close my presentation? I may have. Okay, hang on, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment. Wait, let's see what happens if I do this. Oh, this is a good moment anyway, just to not be sharing. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay, stop sharing it. Okay, so couple points I take away from Eric Berlow's short video, I mean, is just the repeated, the repeated refrain of the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And the more broader we first put our net for information, then the actual better outcomes, and the more likely we're going to find the key influencing factors. That's one. The other, another key takeaway I take from that is the value. He talks about the value of good visualizations that encourage us to ask questions that we wouldn't otherwise think of. And so that's one of the things with Sarah Shanahan of the REAMP Network, who's presenting next week. I remember we were driving to an annual meeting one time, and we were talking and we were just sort of yapping about social system mapping. And all of a sudden she said, "Oh, I've been treating our map like an answer machine, but really it's a question generator." I was like, yes, I really love that shift of perspective that she just made. That you can use it as an answer machine, obviously, but you can also ideally use it as a question generator to help us sink into simplicity. And And the last thing is just, though, he talks again about the discomfort or the anxiety that comes from that kind of overwhelm. So it's like, whenever we're talking about this complexity and asking people to widen the lens a little bit or shift this from this kind of perspective to that kind of a perspective, what I've been realizing lately is that I have spent years sort of failing to notice. I mean, I see it and I recognize the anxiety that it produces, but I've never really thought really hard about how can I reduce that anxiety? You know, like the push is always to make it simpler, make it simple. And I'm always like, but I want the simple on the other side of complexity. And how do I help people go through that simple on the other side? And I haven't really been, so I've been approaching it cognitively, but I've really recently been realizing, you know, I think it needs to be approached viscerally, like in an embodied way, so that we're okay with that confusion and we don't feel threatened by that confusion. And I have also wanted to say this last thing, which is I have been thinking a lot about that anxiety. And one of the things that I've realized is that we live in a culture that values and gives power to a very certain specific kind of knowing. And so if you're strong in that kind of knowing, you get rewarded and you get more power. For those of us who have different kinds of knowing, or for whom that isn't, you know, that center place of power hasn't been accessible for us to begin to access that way of knowing more overtly, that just trying to use that way of knowing is, I'm saying this wrong. It's like being the smartest guy in the room means you get the most power, but it's only one kind of smartness. And that kind of smartness is actually a very reduced, mechanistic, simplified kind of smartness. And so there's all these cultural implications that have to do with not knowing and us not wanting to like reveal that we're not knowing, because then our power will get taken away in certain kinds of contexts. I'm not saying this the way I sometimes do or want to, but that's because I'm sped up and a little bit triggered and anxious because of the content and because there's something I'm trying to get at, and I can tell I'm not doing it. And so one of the things that I asked Jim has a great grounding exercise, and I found it really helpful for me when we're dealing with this stuff. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to have Jim help us get grounded, help me get back centered, help all of us sort of recover from, I know that when I get anxious and sped up, even on a video, I know that I'm creating an energy of anxiety and sped upness, and it's impacting, it's seeping into everyone a little bit. And so first I like to just notice and name it so that you can all say, oh yeah, that's her. I don't really need to be feeling anxious just because she is. But secondly, it does happen. And so we'll take a moment and Jim will help us hopefully release all of that. And then we're going to put you back into your small groups and ask you to talk about ways of working with this dynamic that could be helpful. So, Jim, take it away.
Thanks, Christine. You really set us up here. How much time? 3 minutes?
Yeah, you're usually, yeah. Actually,
Because usually it takes 5.
could go for 5.
But
Take 5.
really?
Yeah.
Okay, it'll be somewhere.
See, time is a thing for me. For me to say take 5 is like, that's me acting out of my less freaked outness.
All right. Wow, I have a lot going on in me here. But let's go ahead and center. You can go ahead and do this off. I'm going to stay on camera as much as I can. And I'm going to stand up. You can sit in your chair, whatever you'd like to do. But we're just going to take a moment to really find ourselves. And you can start by just paying attention to how you're connected to the earth, to your chair, feet on the ground, butt in your chair, elbows on your arm rails, whatever. Feel that pressure. You can soften your gaze. I'm closing my eyes. Take a couple of deep breaths. These are the kind of breaths that you pull in at the top of your lungs and drive down to your stomach and then drive it back out again. So pay attention to that connection with the earth, how the gravity is pulling your body lovingly into the earth through all the structures, right into the ground. Notice also that all of us are connected to that earth together. And we're connected to all the people that have stewarded this earth in ages past. If you want, you can recognize that we have colonized this space, displaced peoples that have stewarded this earth. Okay, so we're talking about 3 dimensions here. The first is this vertical dimension that gravity is pulling us in. And if you can put a string in the top of your head and pull up your body, strengthen, lengthen your spine. This is the dimension of dignity that the generative somatics people talk about. And you can feel that dignity if you want as you pull up. Maybe your chin is up a little bit. Maybe a smile plays across your face. That one's always hard for me. These positions in our body affect how we feel. How we feel affects our position. Feel that for a moment. Take a couple of breaths. And as you hold that dimension, think about your dimension of width out to the side. This is just sort of a metaphoric dimension. Maybe feel it in your fingertips, maybe your arms away from your body, that space between your arms and your body. Maybe feel the air on your body. The sounds around you. This is a dimension of belonging, of connection. What are you connected to? All of us. Lots of other things in your mind. Just notice that. This dimension is often the hardest for me to feel a connection with the environment, easier with people. And now the dimension of depth. Put your hands behind your back, maybe feel behind you. Feel the people that have got your back, that have brought you to this place. You're not here alone. And then in the front, feel about where you're going. Take your front body and feel that moving out into the space and time in front of you, the space in front of you, the opportunities in front of you. And take all 3 of those dimensions and bring them as sort of an intersection to your center of gravity, maybe 4 or 5 inches below your navel. And put your hand on that if you can. Try to feel your dignity, your connectedness, where you've come from, where you're going to, all in this intersection, the center of your body. Just hold that. Your sense of purpose sits there. I'll take a couple of breaths. And then when you're ready, open your eyes, bring your gaze back, turn on your video. can come back together.
Thank you for that, Jim. Okay. So, Kara, have you got is Jim put in a group that he came in late?
He's not, because that would push us out of a group of 3.
Okay,
We have 2 groups of 3.
2 groups of 3. What should we do about that? Do any 2 people, okay, so we like to keep people, I'll explain my logic here. I like to keep people in the same group so that they've introduced themselves and then they can build on what they learned about each other in a second session rather than just getting to know each other again for the second session. So hopefully that feels a little more comfortable. So I like to keep us in the same. So Minma, you're stepping out in a couple minutes. Okay, let's put Jim with Min. But I'll say the reason I was thinking about like the numbers of 3, like when I get put in a breakout group, if I'm with a person who is a bad listener or has a conversationally dominating manner, if I'm with them alone, I get really triggered and angry. If I'm and if I'm feeling at the same time, sometimes I'm feeling really not like really introverted and I really don't want to have to be revealing a whole lot or talking a whole lot. So if there's 3 people, there's kind of like a disequilibrium that keeps the dominating voice from just sort of controlling everything, and also gives, if someone is not feeling like they want to take up a lot of space, it gives them some space to not just feel dominant, like not feel like, oh, I'm surrendering to this turkey who's going on, but like, then I can kind of nudge those 2 to talk to each other a little bit. And so it gives a little more dynamics of power differentials and working with the energy that feels useful to me. Because if I'm stuck for 20 minutes with a person who's overwhelming me, I'm gonna have like a really bad day. So that's why the 3. So that's why I was like really pondering it. But Min, it was so great to have you, and I hope we see you again soon. And so Kara can go ahead and put Jim in with Min's group, and then we'll have 20 minutes to, and the questions are, what helps you feel? So there's 3 questions, and answer them in however it comes up for you. And I invite you to let your body respond to these more than your cognition. But what helps you feel supported when you get overwhelmed, especially when you get cognitively overwhelmed? How can others support you? Support your journey into that discomfort of the cognitively challenging unknown? Or how can we support each other in developing our capacity to work wisely in complexity? So this is all about the interpersonal, emotional, embodied, helping us not feel so threatened and not feel so, it's going to be uncomfortable, but not feel like it's dastardly uncomfortable. So that's the questions that I'd like you to talk about. Oh, and the last thing I want to say is I'm going to put the Mentimeter on a place where you can input stuff. And I know we don't like to be talking and also inputting stuff in Mentimeter because it's a little distracting. But to the degree you're able to, I would love if you can do that, because I'm not in a group and I don't get to see what you guys are doing. And also we will then keep this as something we can share and work with going forward. So trying to leave breadcrumbs, trying to leave something behind from our presence, and not just this interpersonal conversation that then just goes away, but that we have something that we can build on. So the degree you're able, that's an invitation, is to go to that frame. I'm going to move it right there. Oops. There. So your Mentimeter should be in a place where you can input stuff. Okay, I'm through talking. Kara, go ahead and put them in groups. Have a wonderful day, Min. Welcome back. I hope that felt you had good conversations. sure you did. So I want to so I'm looking at your comments. Thank you so much for putting comments at Mentimeter. I know it's not like anybody's ideal behavior, but I really appreciate getting to see what people are saying and that we get to have a nice summary of it. And so just wanted to, so spend the next 5 minutes just hearing what came up for you. And if there's more coming up that you haven't put in the Mentimeter, feel free to add it, but just open it up to your what you surprises, things you're wondering about, things you discovered in whatever order. So we'll just sort of popcorn it one at a time. Feel free to jump in.
I guess in order to get us started, I'll start, and then we're gonna popcorn, you said, Christine.
Yeah.
Okay. Some things that kind of stood out to me in our conversation. I was with Tom and Jim. I guess you can figure that out by looking at the screen. Was that, and I apologize for taking words out of other folks' mouths, but it's kind of just acknowledgement, being present, compassion. Those were like some key asks. I don't have the questions in front of me now, so I don't know what I'm answering off the top of my head. But yeah, so acknowledgement, empathy, compassion, being present. I had mentioned at one point that, like, Christine, I really appreciate the triad thing. I have never heard of that, thought of that, and it just makes so much sense and resonates really well with me. So by having like another person in the room and giving permission, that's the word I feel like I'm looking for, is giving permissions. I'll leave it at that, because I feel like I'm kind of all over the place. Vicky?
We don't have to do it in any order. We can just when you feel, whatever comes up for you, when you feel like speaking, go ahead. Thank you. No, nothing to apologize for. No apologies necessary. I have to practice that myself.
Well, I'll say something anyway. I took a hike this weekend and it was kind of challenging. And it was like a lot of focus on the path where I was putting my feet and the effort to get there and everything, and feeling like, oh yeah, but I'm missing the forest. And then realizing, I don't have to separate these two things out. I can see the beauty in the path and the process itself, even though it is challenging. So I've been thinking a bit about that as a metaphor for how do we go through these places where you're in collective sense making, and it can be so beautiful. But it can be kind of overwhelming for some people who, especially, where there's that need for certainty. And so it's being able to, I think, to hold both of those places, that, yeah, we have to focus down, but we also need to be there for the bigger unfolding of things, which we don't. I mean, it's an emergent process, right? So we don't know what the outcomes are. That don't knowing, I always really respect don't knowing. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Like I realize the overwhelming or the uncomfortableness comes when I feel alone, like the only one in the room that kind of gets what we're trying to do here, as other people's uncomfortableness increases. And then as Dana said, though, the kind of the cure to that's community, which made me ask the question is, if we are operating many times it feels alone, how do we have, and I love the community here because it's kind of like we're all in the same boat. How do we have more spontaneity when we need to bounce off people who do understand what we're doing? So that was the question.
Couple more.
I think in our group, more inclusive environments with different kinds of knowledge were really helpful. And like Tom, I think I'm still wondering how to, Vicky talked about both of, it's not a either or situation in terms of being in a situation where people are going for goals right out of the gate or outcomes, which leaves me feel really uncomfortable. And that's why I'm here doing this work, to sort of build more capacity to work in that situation.
I think we have time for one more, if there's one more. Jacob, I haven't heard you, but I don't want you to feel called out or called on if you don't feel like contributing or talking. But if you do, even if it's totally against the grain of what everybody else is
Okay,
saying,
so I'll do my bit. I think yeah, what we spoke about in the group, I was in group Vicky and Mary, like sort of what I take away from this session is really emphasis on the relationships, the relationship thinking, starting point, but also just like a reminder that the kind of knowing in a complex context, knowing or sort of thinking that you can do one thing and then it leads directly to that specific outcome is almost like an illusion. You do one thing and you're actually not very much in a position to predict what actually comes back to you, and what it causes really. So like I said, like not a sort of dismissal of the scientific mindset, but also like the cause and effect is quite complex, especially like in a sort of like social context. Yeah, so I think that's those are reminders, and also kind of what I take from this session.
thank you. Well, Jim, you haven't spoken, but I'm going to jump to the next step anyway, because I'm guessing you have lots of opportunities to say what you're thinking, and you would have jumped in. So I just want to spend just the last couple minutes letting you know what's up. So this is a small part of a larger bunch of things we do, and not lots of people who sort of come and go, and then a core, a smaller group that kind of sticks with figuring things out together. But so what else is up is next Monday. Well, the first, second, and third Mondays of the month, we have a session like this starting at the same time every week. The one next Monday is going to be, as I said, Sarah Shanahan of the REAMP Network has a map that she and I created together like 5 years ago, and it laid kind of dormant for a couple of years because she was doing some stuff with her data universe, and it didn't make sense to try and update the map. And now it's updated this year. We got it back actually working and updated and having some new data in it. And they had their annual meeting a week and a half ago, and she's going to share the new map, parts of the new map with us, as well as share how she presented the updated map in the annual meeting to her community and how it went. So she's going to share some experiments in doing what we're talking about. And so that'll be, I'm looking forward to that. That's next Monday. And then the Monday after that, there's a graphics team, which includes Mary and Jim and me and this wonderful graphic designer that Mary hooked us up with, who's Sarah Raffo, who's been working on like a visual explainer of how social system mapping works. And we're getting close to, we're not done, but we're getting close to a place where it's really worth sharing with other people for input and feedback and just to get responses. So that'll be 2 Mondays out. That's going to be interesting. Another thing that we've been doing is there's a mapping team, which consists of me and Jim and Mary. And we've been working on developing insight and generating methods around the phases of activity that keep a social system mapping evolving and relevant. So how do we both get it launched, and then how do we do sense making with it, and how do we update it and decide what new questions to ask to it, and how do we keep people, you know, invited in updating the map? So you can, Kara's put a link in the chat about where you can learn more about the mapping team, because that is where we really are practicing what we preach and really are figuring out the actual real deep questions of how do we do this together. And on that note, if you're not on our social system map, we'd love for you to be on our social system map so that we can know about how you're connected to us and we can learn a little bit more about you. And if you are on our map and haven't updated it recently, we would love for you to do that as well. And then the last thing I'll share is that we've started this initiative that I call defining our systems, which is, if we say that social system mapping is about supporting a shift from systems of dominance to systems of connection, what does that even mean? Like, that's really abstract, and we're trying to distill that into something meaningful that we can use to talk about and to share and to think about our community norms, etc. So Kara has also put an invitation to that initiative in the chat. She'll also follow up put all these links in a follow-up email. So if you don't feel like grabbing them right now, don't feel like you have to. And we're at the bottom of the hour. And so we have, I'm gonna say thank you and let us all go, but let's do our goodbye ritual, which, if you're not familiar with our goodbye ritual, is everybody unmute. I'm gonna count down 3, 2, 1. And then we all at the same time, just give each other our blessings and our appreciation for the rest of the day. So feel free to unmute if you want to do this. Bye, Vicki.
Love you.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the day.
Have a
Thank you.
wonderful day.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.